All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the breakout session. My name is Ashwini Joel. I'm the advisor to the executive director of the Institute. And I'm really excited to actually introduce this topic and speakers here because if you're involved in IJIS, I'm sure you all have seen that IJIS actually issued a call for participation. We're standing up a new task force on this topic, and it's called Forensic Investigative Genetic Genealogy. Got it right, Ed?
That's it. Exactly right.
So it's a task force. And the reason we're doing this is that as IJIS, what we strongly believe as a community, anytime a new technology is introduced, we always have to be mindful of the operational use case, how policies are impacted, how staff is being trained. So if the use of that technology is challenged, that we are ready to answer that when the executives and the justice and public safety are asked any questions. So that is the purpose of that task force. So the timing of this breakout session is very timely because I think it's going to give you some insight on what we will be doing in this task force. So this panel is going to talk about, and the title is Leading the Community in Embracing Evolving DNA Technologies. When we were putting our task force together, we're just talking about forensic genetic genealogy, and DNA is part of that. So we have two great speakers here, and I'll introduce Major Edo Carroll, who's a good friend, retired from Fairfax County. Every time we ask him to come speak at IJIS, he is very gracious, and him and I have done a lot of panels on health and wellness, which is also near and dear to our for officer health and wellness. And so now he actually retired from Fairfax and decided to leave the whole state and move to Colorado.
I did.
So he just
yeah.
he just left. And then we also have Paul Belli, retired as an assistant commander from Sacramento County Sheriff's Office. And so again, I'm not going to read the bio. I will let these two gentlemen do their own intro, and they're going to tell you a story here and their own personal experiences. So I'll turn it to Paul to kick this breakout session.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. As you said, my name is Paul Belli. I'm a retired lieutenant. At the end of my career, I was assistant commander for our Centralized Investigations Division. So I spent about 25 years in Sacramento County. I started with probation, went to the sheriff's office. In Sacramento, our agency provided not only courts and corrections and all of that, but patrol as well. Our agency is about 1,600 sworn. We've got about 350 folks in patrol, and then about 150 or so in investigations. I was fortunate enough to do about 13 of my years in homicide as a detective for about 8 years, sergeant for 3 in homicide, and then as a lieutenant for my last year there. As a lieutenant, I also worked as a watch commander in patrol, and then also in corrections. So much of my DNA information, or our uses of DNA, were related obviously to the investigative part, but also to the collections in the jail, right? Looking at rapid DNA technologies, things that we could use maybe to solve some cases and things like that, and see where we could use that in supporting our investigations in the collection. So I'll let Ed introduce himself.
Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. As introduced, Edo Carroll, retired law enforcement. Started in '89, and retired in '23. What a great journey along the way. So Paul had the West Coast covered. I worked the East Coast, just outside Washington, D.C. My colleague is here, Captain Hook. That's his title and name, Captain Hook. Isn't that crazy? But actually, Brendan's been promoted. It would be Major Hook. Not as exciting, but that's okay. Major's a pretty cool rank. But my last 4.5 years on the job, I was in our major crime, cyber, and forensics, and it's about the crime fight. It's about us, law enforcement, and the community, solving the most violent of crimes. Homicide, rapes, aggravated assaults, those things that shock our community. And we're going to talk about forensic, investigative, genetic genealogy, changing the way law enforcement handles major criminal investigations. I mean, that's where we are in our society, is looking at the crime fight. How can we get victims the justice that they deserve? Families that are waiting for law enforcement to solve a case. It's not closure. Any police executive that takes to the microphone and says, we brought closure to the family, it's not closure. And it's not our decision that this is closure. What we're trying to do is bring some justice. Find those responsible for the heinous crimes that they've committed and bring them to justice. Put them through the criminal justice system, which would include their day in court and a judge or a jury to decide their fate. But law enforcement has the responsibility, victims, and trusts that we are getting it right. And what has come to law enforcement in the past couple of years is this new technology. It works, we're successful with it, but we've only done a few of the tens of thousands of cases that we need to work on. So it's a pleasure being here. I appreciate IJIS taking on genetic genealogy, similar to what's been done kind of in other forms. Facial rec is another journey that it's been on, with the public input, law enforcement need to get answers quicker, and genetic genealogy is now kind of in that same space. We can solve cases. We're going to talk about just a few of them.
Obviously, we've kind of explained a little bit of our careers and where we came from. And one thing I did not mention was I've also been on the board for the International Homicide Investigator Association for about 12, 13 years. And it's really been interesting. I think my first conference was in '09, and it's been interesting to see the evolution of how we're using investigative technologies, and really how much access we've gained to that over the years. I was talking to Ed earlier about our cell phone cases, screaming the Latin long to my partner, who can then, put a pin on a Google Earth map. And that was how we were having to map all of our cases. Now you have cell hawk technologies. You have all these other things that are available to you to speed up your investigation, but also when you look at personnel costs, right? You can increase the amount of work you can do with that technology, but also looking at how well we're using analysts and the number of analysts we have in agencies. So I don't know, obviously, everybody in the room here, being my first IJIS conference, and it sounds like there's a lot of repeat folks here and not too many very new folks, but just remember that you guys, if you want to interrupt us for a question, please do. You're not going to hurt our feelings by any stretch, and I would much rather actually that conversation probably would come up with something somebody else is thinking. So we want to ask you guys a question. When you hear DNA, what's the newest development that you can think of in the last 10 to 30 years?
Rapid DNA.
Rapid DNA, that's huge, right?
Yeah, and that's a great point. Do you all know what the process of rapid DNA is? Anybody kind of new to that?
I mean, I'm aware of what it is.
Sure. So if I could, I'll give you like a 60-second snippet. So in law enforcement, when DNA is collected from the scene, let's just say offender DNA, or what we suspect is offender DNA, the traditional process is collected by a crime scene tech. Could be a sworn member, could be a professional member, like a civilian in the crime scene world. You've seen the shows. You watch CSI, right? The van pulls up, they jump out, they're collecting DNA. When that's sent off to a laboratory, usually a municipal laboratory, like in Virginia, we use the Virginia Department of Forensic Science. In Colorado, CBI, Colorado Bureau of Investigations. It takes months for these returns to come back. And that's just the way the process is. You have a drug case, you send the drugs off, you're waiting for a lab sheet to confirm that it's marijuana or heroin. It just takes a while. Labs are overwhelmed. It could take sometimes a year or more for lab results to come back. Fairfax County, Virginia, we're one of the agencies like Sacramento and others that have moved into the rapid DNA business. We have a machine that can scientifically give you results in 90 minutes on site at the police department in our crime scene unit, where we can put a sample in. We have the offender in the interview room. I can scientifically connect or correlate the person in that interview room left the cigarette at the homicide, or abandoned DNA, dropped the drink cup. Again, we're not competing with the lab. We're still going to do the lab route, but cops and detectives and our professionals need answers sooner. And rapid DNA is one of the latest breakthroughs to give us investigative leads sooner. I almost equate it to face rec. It's not warrant, it's not something you do to go arrest somebody, but it gives you an investigative lead. Because it could confirm that the person in the interview room dropped the cigarette at the homicide, or equally as important, the DNA doesn't match. The dude you're interviewing is not scientifically the person that smoked that cigarette. That's cool. Thanks for bringing that up. It's pretty neat technology. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and when you look at sometimes the labor intensity on that, I was fortunate enough to work on the Golden State Killer case. So we get the name of Joseph D'Angelo, and then we follow him for weeks. We do surreptitious DNA collections, right? How you do those is really dependent on what the DA is going to allow you to use. I was telling Ed that in some of our surreptitious collections at restaurants, we would get mixtures of DNAs on utensils that were only used by that particular person. So kind of gross. I always use a straw now. I typically don't drink out of a glass. But those kinds of things happen. If you're trying to swab a door handle on a car, right? You can't use that for your arrest warrant. So you do a trash runs, you're doing a variety of things like that, so you don't get mixtures. But we still had an entire team following him, because once you've identified that person, whether they're likely to offend at that particular time or not, if they do, you're kind of on the hook, right? So there's a lot of those developments you can do. I would also argue too that in the last 10 to 30 years, one of the biggest advancements is the use of forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or I think IJIS probably is a little easier. Although FIG is a good way to say it as well. So it also opens up a lot of questions, a lot of policies. How is that information going to be used? How is it going to be stored? A variety of things like that.
So I'm going to just bring up this case. This is a 1987 case from Fairfax County, Virginia. A 14-year-old girl is tricked into the fact that she won a set of airline tickets to go to Hawaii. She plans to bring her mom. It's one of those radio, calls back in the day. If your phone rang, are you listening to the radio station? Are you listening to this radio station? And if you were, you'd win a prize. Well, there was a monster lurking amongst the community and calling random people. 14-year-old girl answered the phone, and she's tricked into winning these set of tickets. Now, back in 1987, and not much different than 2024, when the case happens, you get a wanted poster. You have a sketch artist sketching what the offender looks like, the victim articulating. In 2024, you probably have a video, a still shot that you're creating a wanted poster and say, this is the guy that is the bad person. Be on the lookout. If anyone sees this person, call the police. But in 87, they're doing a sketch artist. Now she's tricked into winning these tickets. She gets a ride from an older friend, goes to the radio station, gets out of the car. She thinks she's walking towards the front doors, and he's like, I'm over here. Well, she walks over there. Gun comes out. This rapist forces her in the car, takes her to a secluded area in Fairfax County, and rapes her. Now this woman, this victim, waited 35 years for justice. Now, if you're familiar with the workflow, when you have offender DNA, the FBI started a program called CODIS, CODIS, CODIS. I see some head shaking, right? Database started in 90 as a launch. It was fully implemented nationwide in 98. This is pre-CODIS. This is 87, 1987. And when I took to the microphone, I said, it's the year I graduated high school. A gallon of gas was 97 cents. President Ronald Reagan spoke what would be his famous words at the Berlin Wall. And a 14-year-old girl was raped. And you know what? We interviewed 85 people over 3.5 decades. 85. You know who we didn't interview? The rapist. Because traditional law enforcement's tough. It's a needle in a haystack. It was a stranger attack. But 35 years later, one of the captains, or now majors, detectives, took a case off the shelf and sent it off for advanced DNA technology. And through the use of one of two databases, we were able to identify the monster. He lived 7 miles from headquarters. Detectives that went out with arrest warrants. After we got confirmation DNA, he abandoned his DNA. We collected it. It was a direct match. The rape kit from 1987 matches the DNA that we've collected. That's the probable cause. We got an arrest warrant. We locked him up. We knocked on the victim's door. Lives in South Carolina. And if you do the math, 35 plus 14, she's a young lady. And she's lived a life of horrors. Waiting for what? For us to do something. In traditional law enforcement, he wasn't in CODIS. The case stalled. What are you doing? You're waiting for the guy to get locked up. So the CODIS success rate is about 50%. So if you're just waiting for CODIS hits, we're just going to sit around and wait for CODIS hits. So we used genetic genealogy. We identified him. We did confirmation DNA. The dude went to jail, rightfully so, albeit 35 years later. Married with kids, living just a few miles from headquarters. And that woman, when we knocked on her door, wept, thinking, you know what? You cared that much. 3.5 decades later, you preserved the evidence, you thought about me, and you got the monster. I gotta say, and this is one of about 1,000 cases nationally, only 1,000 that we've been successful on. So pretty cool stuff.
So obviously we have the traditional examples of DNA. Obviously we have O.J. Simpson, right? One of the DNA cases out there. Obviously one of the most high-profile cases with regards to televised prosecution and televised foibles, maybe by law enforcement, or certainly at least that shadow of a doubt cast upon what it was that they were doing, right? When we look at some of these cases too, we also look at what did that propel law enforcement to do better at? Well, I think if you look at O.J. Simpson, the thought processes around how you're doing your evidence packaging, how you're handling your evidence, how you're doing your collections, it certainly propelled your CSI folks, an entire industry of professional staff CSI, as well as your sworn CSI folks, to really get into the groove of, okay, we got to really lock this down and get these things done, because when we go to trial, those are kind of things that can happen. The Amanda Knox story, I think there's a Netflix thing on that. There's certainly some a variety of documentaries related to it. Ed was telling me that I guess he had the opportunity to see her speak, and she talked a little bit about the Netflix. It wasn't quite how it portrays it to be. And then we have Joseph D'Angelo here. Just as a side note, he didn't need a wheelchair. He could walk just fine. Much of that was ease on our part for transporting him back and forth to court, because he wanted to kind of start slow shuffling after doing good push-ups and things like that in his jail cell prior to court. So these are just a few examples, and I think Ed one of the things you said earlier with regards to, the victims of these cases. In D'Angelo's case, many rapes, 14 murders. It's weird how small the world actually is. When you look at like D'Angelo's case, I had met some of the victims of his sexual assault, and these happened in started at least in Sacramento. 75, he'd actually been offending there much earlier that we discovered after we figured out who he was. But these folks had carried this for a lifetime, right? I believe in being very victim-centered, but sometimes that statement might indicate that maybe we're not as focused on the suspect or people that come under scrutiny of law enforcement as possible suspects, right? When you're taking DNA from a large group of folks, you are impacting those people, right? You're not saying, hey, I think you're a suspect. You're explaining to them that, hey, we're trying to get your DNA to maybe rule you out, right? That doesn't necessarily feel any better to some of those folks. And how we're going to end up continuing to do that when we talk about some of the policies, and certainly with the institution of genetic genealogy, those folks that may not even ever know that we looked at, their genetic code, I guess, for lack of a better word. Ed's a lot smarter on that stuff than I am. Checking out their centimorgans to know whether or not they're related, right? But I can't imagine getting a call out of the blue to say, hey, do you know this person? So how you handle that call as an investigator is incredibly important. I don't know if anybody saw the TikTok video that a gal in San Diego put out after she had been contacted because officers were doing a genetic case and they thought she might be related. It was interesting. She did kind of a public freakout thing. You can't guard against that, but how you do that, I think, can certainly help mitigate some of those problems in your investigations.
All right, so this is where we heard it earlier about FIG, forensic investigative genetic genealogy. You heard other terms, right? FGG, IGG, GG. They're all the same. Whether some people call it this, some people call it that. It's using genetic genealogy. And there's only two databases that law enforcement can and would search when they use genetic genealogy. And you're welcome to take a photograph of the screen if that's easier, or you can write everything down, or I can send it to you. You're writing so fast, it's like a typewriter. Do you know what a typewriter is? I say typewriter, and all of a sudden, no, this is true. I say typewriter, I'm like, that's like 1980s. So, but you don't know this, but I'm going to be a grandfather. I got a grandbaby on the way. A little baby girl. That's exactly right. So I got a follower from LinkedIn. Someone follows me on LinkedIn. But you know what? No matter what you call it, it's science. Now, Golden State Killer, as Paul mentioned, was only in 2018. 2018. So we're 5 or 6 years into this business, very early on into using this technology, but it works, and it's an independent witness. And those databases, the two that I mentioned, two that I'm talking about, GEDmatch, and you're going to see another slide on this, GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, our community has opted in to allow us to search. When this first started, some of the controversy, rightfully so, was these databases, oftentimes the individuals had to opt out. That is no longer the case. It's not the fine print where you gotta, what do I have to opt out? No. Let's just take GEDmatch as an example. If you participate maybe socially through your family, you want to find out your grandparents or an uncle that you never met, you do this work. when you sign up for GEDmatch and provide your DNA, you have a disclaimer and opt in to allow law enforcement to search for violent crime. And you know what? Over 80%, nearly 85% of those participating, sign me up. I want law enforcement to use this technology to find monsters and killers that are what? That are living amongst us. Nearly 85% say, yeah, that's good. I'm good if it's for violent crime. And studies that have been done, surveys, most community members don't use it for lower level crime. Don't use it for car break-ins or burglary. You could, but the community isn't interested in that. The DOJ interim policy on this says you cannot use it. You can only use it for the most serious of crimes, or unidentified human remains, UHRs. Law enforcement pulls up to a body on the side of the road, no ID. Fingerprints do not result in anything, so they have no arrest record. Maybe there's no fingerprint hit. What are you gonna do? You know what's been done for decades and decades? Jane Doe, John Doe. There are does that don't have their names, and that's another lawful reason. And you can use NamUs and look for all the similar cases to try to identify your does. But genetic genealogy can be used to give that individual who deserves their name back. In Fairfax County, I'm proud to say we've had several does, and I've identified who they are. And when we knock on the door and we say, we believe we found your daughter, your sister, your mother, the family's so thankful that we use the latest science and technology. We use genetic genealogy, FIG, IGG, GG, whatever you call it, it's the same thing. But remember, our public is opting in. It's not an opt-out. That's the way it used to be. Books were cleaned up. Anyone that allows us is opting in. And I'll finish on this, because I'm going to turn back over to Paul, is the biggest misconception. If I went out, and I will be out on the streets of Nashville tonight, I'm going to be downtown here. You're going to see me down there. If I ask most of the people walking on the sidewalk what databases can be searched, I would say a majority of people say, oh yeah, you can access Ancestry, 21andMe, Heritage DNA, right? You've heard of all these. You know what the answer is? No. We cannot access those. If you look at the terms of service, those databases, and those are just three of several, there's several more, there's no meddling for law enforcement in those databases. Now, I tell you, if we had access, let's just take one, the most popular one amongst everybody in the community is Ancestry. Over 20 million profiles in there. Imagine if we could. I'll take GEDmatch as an example. That's one of the only two. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Those are the only two. GEDmatch has about 2 million profiles. But we have nearly a 90% success rate to get to the second cousin on any case you give me. That's pretty good. Now, I can tell you, I don't know many of my second cousins, but what we build is that family tree. Sometimes we get lucky, it's a first cousin. Sometimes we get real lucky, it's a parent, sibling, or immediate relative of offender DNA, because that's what we're targeting. I say targeting, that's a bad word. Let's strike that word, edit that. We're not really targeting anything, but that's our point. We want to identify who the offender is. Or as Paul said, equally important, exonerate the innocent. Amanda Knox, clear you of what you didn't do. I mean, justice is blind, and it should be. But you know what we relied on when I came on in '89 and in the '90s? He did it. She's the one that did it. Witness identification is what? Terrible. Right? I see some edge, like, I don't know. I mean, it's like the Perry Mason. Those shows are in black and white. There's not even a color screen. Why? Because those days are gone. We need an independent witness and DNA is unbiased. And again, we're looking for a direct correlation between whoever did the crime, their DNA oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes is left behind.
And DNA is, I mean, it's not the panacea, right? I mean, again, obviously my background is in investigations. All evidence is evidence in context. It doesn't matter, you know, what that evidence is. You have to be able to explain the why, right? Just because you find DNA, you can't put a timestamp on that. You don't know when that was actually put there or how it got there. But when you develop that context around the actual investigation, you can. I think probably one of the neatest things, obviously, I love solving these murders and things like that. But the unidentified human remains, the sheer volume of the number of those that are out there, that this will and can likely, you know, give them their name back, right? Identify these folks. Many are obviously also murder victims, right? So it serves a twofold purpose related to that. Now, there are some limitations, as Ed said, with the databases, right, as to what the representation is, who it is that's putting their DNA in there. You know, you look at like tribal entities and whether they're actually going and putting their information in there to allow for that search. So they're opting in to be searched. Culturally, not so much, right? African Americans are underrepresented in there as well. So getting that information out, and I think probably the biggest thing is making sure people understand it's an opt-in. You don't have to. Do we want you to? Yes, right? But you don't necessarily have to for that. And you can change that with the click of a button. So my hope is that we do see a lot more representation amongst all those other members, because there are a lot of folks out there that they don't know where their family member is, and we don't know who those people are. So when we talk about the policy, obviously 2018 it was kind of it's the Wild West. I would argue a little bit it is still kind of the Wild West out there when it comes to policy. There are significant concerns depending upon who you're talking to and what areas they represent. If you look at, you know, the information, the genetic information that's developed with something like that, with doing these cases, the genetic cases, there's a lot of information about you genetically, maybe not you as the name, right? We don't get that name necessarily, but there's a lot of information that your healthcare providers would love to have, your insurance providers would love to have, and so developing how you're storing that information. It's funny because a lot of folks we were kind of late in adopting body-worn cameras. And I tell people that, oh, why don't you have those yet? And I go, the cameras are free. You know how much storage is, right? And then how long are you going to store it? What's your policy on that, right? So these types of things are exactly what you do have to catch up. DOJ, I think, did a pretty good job of at least trying to get it on paper about how you should be using this. You know, probably the most important thing is it's an investigative tool. It isn't just like facial recognition. It's not, hey, that it just spit out, this is who you are, and you kick in the door and you take the person to jail. That's not how this works. So they haven't updated it, which I think is somewhat interesting to me. I don't necessarily know why, but I do think that what they're looking for is a lot of input, right? So I think that your task force on FIG is going to be huge. The national technology validation, so the lab folks, that policy, when you read it, you know, there's some things as a detective, okay, I get it. I know why that stuff's being put in there. But we still have to get to that point of what are we comfortable with. There are a number of folks on the other side of the aisle, from my viewpoint, that really want to put a pause on FIG. They want to stop the use, period. until there's a policy that comes out. When you look at Maryland, their state law that they put into place, they were kind of the first ones, so I can see that there's a lot of compromise on both sides of the aisle for that. There's a number of states that look at things like that, lawmakers, you know, they'll just cut and paste, right? Without all of the stakeholders being able to weigh in on what would be the best policy, right? And I will tell you as a detective, if it wasn't illegal and there was no case law on it, and it was something that I could use to solve a case, I'd probably use it, right? Unless it was like super oogie, and I can't think of anything that necessarily fell to that level. But did I lie to people? I did, right? I had case law that supported I could do things like that. There was nothing on FIG, and we were like, okay, well, I think this is really, the technology is finally there to where we can use it. We at a working group related to GSK, we talked about that in like 2011, and it just took that long for the technology to catch up. So with that in mind, we obviously don't want to lose it. We've done a lot of training with agencies and folks that are using it to encourage best practices, but we're still working on codifying those best practices. There's not a lot of agencies out there that even have a policy per se. They're using other policies, or they've grabbed the DOJ interim policy and said, hey, this is the go-by related to that. So I think once it actually gets looked at on a level like the FIG task force, you're going to end up seeing it in Lexipol as a canned policy, right? And I think that'll help agencies at least come up with what would work best for them in their local area and whatever their culture is related to their regional use of it or state use of it. I think Ed kind of covered a lot of this. I mean, it's a investigative tool, and this is the study, the U.S. General Population Survey. 91% of the general population supports it in violent crime, which I think that makes sense. You know, do I necessarily want it being used for burglary? Yeah, if I give my TV back, I guess, maybe, you know, but honestly, probably not, right? We need to use this judiciously for those crimes, I think, that are obviously the most heinous, those folks that we really do need to get out of society. So, and then obviously we've seen all the other privacy implications. We've seen license plate readers. They've run its course to where they're fairly ubiquitous now. I think a lot of states have policies related to it, and then actual state laws. Some are a little far off the beaten path as far as I'm concerned, but obviously facial recognition, that's a huge controversial topic as well. Like, how are you using it? When we look at things like how China uses some of their surveillance technologies, that's a legit fear, right? For how they're using it. I would hope we don't get there. You know, we do have the Constitution, but they've trimmed a lot of fat off the Constitution for the last 3 years, in my opinion. So I could see them continue to try to kind of thin that out a little bit more. And then obviously gunshot detection, location, and other, you know, all those other surveillance type.
So this is kind of a screenshot. We're working for those victims, but we're also, there's Project Innocence here, looking to exonerate those that are wrongfully zeroed in on. And it's no fault of the detective or the judge or the jury that convicted them. It's just the journey that these cases are on. And, you know, DNA, again, is that independent. So these are the people that matter, those victims, those survivors. Again, those wrongfully accused and maybe wrongfully convicted. You've seen the articles. Person in prison for 30 years getting released from jail. Why? Because DNA actually has cleared that. I wouldn't survive 3 minutes or 3 days, maybe 3 weeks, but 30 years? So that's where the power of DNA is just so super important. So I know we only have 2-3 minutes. Paul's going to talk a little bit about training.
So obviously, I think training we've hit on. It's hugely important for everybody, right? Whether you're training your community as to the expectations, or training the community about how it is that your agency is utilizing these technologies, I think it's huge. And we don't always get in front of that as best as we should in public safety or policing, which I like that analogy this morning. So I think it's really important you figure out what your baseline training needs are. We've seen a lot of turnover in law enforcement, a lot of turnover. I remember going back to patrol as a watch commander. My senior patrol officer was 3 years in patrol. When I went to patrol, my senior patrol officer on my team was 23 years in patrol. So when I'd go make a decision at a call for service, standing next to him, I go, hey, this is what I'm gonna do. He'd go, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You can't do that, right? But when you've got 2 6-month police officers there, they're making the best decisions they can based on their training and experience. And outcome might be good, but when you look at the decision making behind that, it's maybe not as good. So you're trying to essentially create that wisdom through training. And I do think that that's important, obviously recurrent and advanced. And I think you also have to look at your proximal training needs. You know, what is it that supports what your outcome goal is? If it's DNA and you're using that in investigations, then obviously you need to have good interviewing skills so that you're not introducing other problems and you're getting the best product you can to make sure that you're not having those wrongful convictions and things of that nature. We've seen even on the interviewing front some of that, how that can go awry as well.
So there's funding out there, because there's an expense to getting this kind of science work done. But there's organizations. One is Season of Justice, SOJ. I've got some information right here in my coat pocket. If you have a case in your community, we'll put you over to Season of Justice. They'll help fund some of this. What we did in Fairfax, we made it an earmark. This is that important. Buy one less car. Like these cases, you got to spend a little bit to get the return on investment. And it's a good investment. Don't ask me. Ask the victim that was raped, with the family of the homicide survivor. Nationally, only about 50% of homicides get solved, even with the great work that Paul and International Homicide Investigators Association does. So do you know how many unsolved homicides we have in the United States? 250,000. 250,000 unsolved homicides. That's a lot. And we've got to do better. We have to bring up our solve rate. And we're doing it through tech. License plate readers, flock cameras, digital downloads of cell phones and tower dumps. The other part of that is DNA. We got to do better. We got to increase our solve rates and give the justice to the family that is waiting for us to do it and do it right. So that concludes the short presentation. Any questions for Paul and I? Yeah.
So the question on training, so for maybe less well-funded agencies, I mean, how do you, can a regular officer, like in nowhere America, can they interpret these results, or is the service provided to interpret, I mean, you can't just like get a login to blah, blah, blah and enter my stuff, right? So
Right.
how do you execute that transaction? I mean, obviously, because you want to have a lead that's then viable and then you can then stand behind for prosecution purposes.
You know,
What training?
you could train in Nowhere America or Middle America. You
Right.
could train an analyst to be able to do that genealogical work,
But
right?
staff-wise, is it practical?
It's-
What's a good
it's
model
not.
for that, for less well-funded jurisdictions?
So if I could, that was the last slide. There are several models. You can outsource third party.
Yeah.
There are several labs that will do all this work for you. I have this case. You turn it over to an accredited third-party laboratory to get your profile, your SNP, SNP, get your SNP profile, send it off for genealogy. Big departments, the ones that can fund it, you could bring some of this in-house or a hybrid of both. But it's expensive. That's why I said you could find funding. If you know of a small agency that has a case, call me. We can take it off the shelf. We'll get seasoned justice to maybe fund one. Once you start funding one, the momentum picks up. You could have 2 people shot last night on the streets of Nashville. Yeah, that's going to get some attention. And I can tell you this because I was the public affairs director for the police department. You look at the algorithms, you solve a case from 47 years ago, I had 22 media outlets in the briefing room because they're like, wow. So once you solve one, you can get that momentum. And back to the point about the small department training, maybe they could host something. And you sometimes get a slot or two.
All kinds of collaboration, all that kind of stuff.
All sorts of
That's
collaboration.
like, you know, that's table stakes for some of these other problems. It was just more a matter of understanding. If you hang around, we're gonna talk about digital evidence in a minute. But yeah, just this notion of, okay, we're introducing all these other pieces of things into the stack of tools that are available to law enforcement. Now you gotta have one more guy who has an interest or one more person who has an interest in this thing to then get trained, and then, you know, you've got it complicates your staffing models.
I think
complex
your
situation.
best use at that point is making them aware that it's out there.
Yeah.
And how it's used. Not, hey, you need to sit down and do the work, right? You're not at your kitchen table doing this, but it's available. It's available for free through the FBI in some instances as well,
Okay.
right? You do have, I think that we always joked in homicide, we need to have a bake sale, right? So that we can do whatever, and I'll bring the
solve
brownies,
that, yeah.
and so that we can do that. There is significantly more interest in these cases because of FIG, I think,
Yeah.
that there are more funding models out there. And I think agencies are recognizing too, they have to make it a line item. That's not to say that, 80% of law enforcement in the United States is 10 people or less.
Yeah. That's what I'm asking.
But their state, typically those folks have the ability to go to their state labs, their state investigative agencies. I realize they don't always get what they want.
Well, they're also underfunded too. So.
They're underfunded
They're
as well.
overworked and underfunded.
Yeah.
Fairfax, big agency, right? 1.2 million residents. We crowdfunded a few of our cases. That's a little bit controversy, but the community said, hey, I'll kick up $5, and we got enough money to fund several cases. Then we spent the money, got some grants. You got to do something. Because my only point is, I'll finish with this note, if you don't do something,
Nothing's gonna happen.
you're not going to do anything. What's the alternative? I was in Suffolk County, New York yesterday. Serial killer, right? 11 people killed and bodies dumped on Long Island. I met with the Suffolk County Homicide Squad, and they're all in on this business now because they know, that monster's not in CODIS. Brian, the dude out in Idaho, the quadruple homicide, Brian's driving across country with his dad in his car. He's not in CODIS. So this is the kind of the newest investigative tool to get those answers that are needed.